Hi, and welcome everybody into this introduction into accessibility. I'd like to take you on a journey into the world of accessibility and make you become more aware of its advantages and specifics. This is not a very technical session, meaning I won't go into many details concerning web development, but it might still prove useful. Let's get started with a statement. We should care about accessibility. Sounds like a valid statement. I think Ryan here would agree, but still poses the very good question why? Why should we care about accessibility? And let me ask you a different question. Do you think yourself as a disabled person? Do you think you have a disability? Most people would say, no, I don't consider myself disabled. That's a very normal answer. Most people would think disabled people are people in wheelchairs, people who are deaf or blind. And yes, those people fit into a category of disabled, of being disabled. But it is not the very broad disability category I would like to emphasize today. The way you think about disability is not a strange one. It is the same definition that the World Health Organization defined in the 80s. It is a personal attribute, meaning it is something very specific to you, which is still true, but a very physical and very clear one. Like, for example, being deaf or blind. They redefine that vision into a much more broader way of talking about disabilities, which is much more real as we experience it today. And I'm going to have to read this from my prompter because it is a very technical definition. Currently, it is not just a health problem, it is a complex phenomenon reflecting the interaction between features of a person's body and features of the society in which he lives. A very technical definition of saying that. A simpler way to say it would just be that a disability is just a mismatched human interaction. You are mismatching with the environment around you. That could be by being blind or deaf, but it could be much more subtle. And it is that subtlety that I'd like to talk to you about today. To make this a bit more practical, I want to show you a definition, well, a table, a visual that Microsoft made for their inclusive design handbook. It is a table, consists of 4 categories, talking about touch, seeing, hearing, and in those categories, there are 3 subcategories. There is a permanent, a temporal, and a situational way of thinking about being disabled. The permanent ones are very obvious. You can think of a touch permanent person as somebody with one arm. For seeing, that would be a blind person. For hearing, that would be a deaf person. For speaking, that could be a nonverbal person. Very straightforward examples. But if we go into the temporal one, you'll see it starts to get a little bit closer to home. You'll start to recognize it more. For touching, that would be somebody with an arm injury. I think most of you have already had an arm injury or a leg injury at one point in your life. For seeing, that could be somebody with cataract, something that will grow on you when you get older. I hope you won't, but it might be. Temporal one could be somebody with an ear infection. For speaking, that could be somebody with laryngitis. Now, when we dive into the situational ones, you'll see it becomes very, very close to home. For situational, that could be somebody who's become a new parent. As a new parent, you will quickly realize you need more than 2 limbs to do things. You could be holding your child, holding a bottle, at the same time somebody's calling you. You need that 3rd arm. So very situational. For seeing, that could be a distracted driver, somebody in a car distracted by a phone, a child, a screen, a pedestrian crossing the street suddenly. So those distractions are very real. For hearing, that could be a bartender in a very noisy bar, not being able to hear what people say. And for the speaking, that could be somebody with a heavy accent, making it very difficult to understand. These examples make it really easy to understand that somebody can be disabled without having to lose an actual arm or a leg or being deaf or blind. So, when I return, why should we care about accessibility? Because accessibility might be essential to some, it is useful for everyone. And why is it useful for everyone? Because everybody is only temporarily abled. There's only a small portion in your life, I hope it's a large one, but there's a small portion in your life where you're a completely 100% healthy person without having anything that disables you from doing anything. Now, when we look at studies that have been done, for example, in the United Kingdom, they've done a study in 2020, and they saw that almost 24% of their citizens were disabled in some way or another. That's more than 16 million people. And those disabilities spread from a variety of categories. It could be a mobility issue, it could be a hearing issue, it could be a mental issue. These are categories that are very broad, but they do have an impact on how we design and build web applications today. They're very important to take into account. Now, when you see that there are so many people, like 1 in 4 in the UK, you might be thinking, well, we must be legally obliged to do something about this. It must be really important. Concerning the legalities, it gets a bit difficult. Yes, we have got laws. Can we just ignore accessibility? No, we can't. When we look at Europe, we see we have a very clear law ahead of us, the European Accessibility Act, the EAA, which goes into effect this June, which is primarily focused on the private sector. So that could be companies like us, but it could be a shopping site like, for example, Amazon. They will have to abide by these laws. These are not new laws. They are follow-ups on laws that already exist in the European Union. For example, those for the public sector. Your local government or higher government already have to abide by these rules. Now, why am I going into these legal mumbo-jumbos and these technicalities? That's not super important, might be relevant for your company, but what is important is what they're based on. And what they're based on is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Another mouthful, big acronym, WCAG. It's already from 1995 in one way or another, but this is actually the one true rulebook that you should be looking at, especially in web development, because this one true rulebook tells you what you have to do, what you can't do, and how in very specific ways that you need to solve problems for your users. The WCAG guidelines were created by the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, a organization that's probably already well known if you're a web enthusiast. They created the WCAG Standard 2, which is the current one in production. There are subdivisions. There are version 3 in the works, but let's just look at number 2, the version 2, because that is the one that will be used into laws. The WCAG 2 standard is the golden standard for accessibility professionals. It is used in laws, as I said. Many countries use this as a basis for their local laws concerning accessibility. Now, what are these WCAG rules based on? They're based on 4 categories, core categories. An application has to be perceivable, it has to be operable, it has to be understandable, and it has to be robust. You can understand these things as, for example, an operable application can have a subset of rules. That means that a button needs to be clickable. It needs to be operable by a keyboard. It just has to work. Your application, of course, has to be robust. It has to be understandable for your users, so you cannot use too technical terms when you're putting text on screens. There are many rules and guidelines in this book. This set of this rule book that you can use. Does that mean that you have to abide by all of them? It would be best if you abide by all of them, but that would be nearly impossible, I think, for most applications. So we have a conformity level. This level is based on three levels: a single A, double A, and triple A value. A single A is the minimum score that you can work on. The double A is the standard for most laws and most requirements. And the triple A is the maximum you can get. If you go for the maximum, which could be a whole lot of work, you could be working this for quite a long time. It doesn't mean that your application will be 100% accessible per se. Could be. But these rules will guide you to a web application that is very accessible. Aim for the AA standard. That's the good one. Now, to put this into perspective, how many websites actually are accessible? The company WebAIM does a yearly survey and takes the 1 million top websites in search rankings and looks at their homepage. What they found this year, well, for the past year, so the 2025 results are for the 2024 survey, they found that about 94.6% of websites had issues. These issues are in categories. We'll take 6 categories with the big issues that are present. The main issue that we found, well, that they found, is a low contrast issue. meaning you could have a header image, which is a beautiful image, and put some text in front of that, which is white text, for example. And in some places, for example, on my shirt, that text would be completely unreadable because it matches the color and it has very low contrast with the background. Could be, for example, links that have a very light color on a light background could have very low contrast issues. We see that this is 97% of websites that have this issue, which is very high. Another category of issues that might occur are images that do not have an alternate text. This alternate text is placed in code and explains what the image is about. If you have an image of a tree, the alt text should describe what's on that image, for example, a tree standing in a field. When your image is broken, your link is broken to the image, the text will be displayed. But more important, that text that is present with your image also tells other tools like search engine optimization tools, for example, Google, what the image is about, but also tools like screen readers. So people who are blind rely on screen readers to explain to them what is on the website. If your image does not have an alt text, that user will not know what the image is about. Another issue that might be present on your website and is present on a lot of websites is a missing label for a button or a link. So the 2% you see is for buttons and links. This example you see on screen could be a very common one, a button with an icon. That icon could be a trash can, explaining to me that this button might delete something. However, the meaning of that icon is very specific, could be culturally based, and some other people might not know what this trash can means. If they do not have a trash can that looks like that, it might be completely unknown to them. Also, when we return to the screen readers, they will read this button as button, label, and then it could be, if it doesn't have an alternate label, that it reads the Unicode value of that icon. So that would be button, label, /F3654, for example. That does not give any meaning about the button and the action that it will follow when clicking it. So always add a label to a button, either visual or in code, if you would like. The same thing was for links, but the same thing also goes for our next category, and that is labels on form fields. Form fields often don't have labels when they're in a very small context. For example, I think the use case for this on the homepage would be a search field or a login form. Usually those don't have a visual label above or next to them, but they have a placeholder text. When you click that field, that placeholder text disappears. Some other tools also might not be able to read that placeholder text because they look for labels that are near. Again, put a label on top next to it that it's a visual. Or if for one reason or another you can't put a visual label on that, add that label into code that it is linked to that field so tools like screen readers know what that field is about. And the final example is something that is also very important and is rather invisible on a website, and that is the language code connected to that website. It is usually added in the HTML tag at the top of your page, and it tells a browser or an assistive tool what language your content is in. If that language was to be set into a language that is different than your content, for example, the default could be English, but you have a website in Dutch, a screen reader tool would read that web page in English. If your content is Dutch, that would sound really weird because those words don't match with the language that is spoken. Now, let me take a small side quest here before I dive into disabilities in specifics. Let me show you an example of why accessibility is important for some, but essential for some, but important for everyone. The example you see on screen is a curb, which has a cut form. Usually it's found on corners. This is called, well, this image has an effect named by it, the curb cutting effect. The example here in specific was a curb that was cut specifically for wheelchair users. Those users had problems mounting the sidewalk because of the very high edges of the curb. So they cut the curb, making it much more easy for wheelchair users to mount the curb. But what they also found and weren't planning for is that other users, like for example, people with strollers, people with luggage carts, or any other thing that is on wheels or needs to be dragged around, benefits from these cut curbs. If you have a small child and you take it cycling, for example, and they have to ride on the sidewalk, you will look for these cut curbs for your children to get on and off the sidewalk. You will for definitely know that they will face plant on the curb if they have to take a big one. So this was made for wheelchair users, not taking into account all the other uses, but as you can see, it is so advantageous. It's such a big advantage for all the other users. Other examples that are also well known, for example, are subtitles or captions. Those were originally designed for people who could not hear films, television, any of those other sorts of things in those mediums. But as you can see now, they are very present on Instagram videos and TikTok movies, and they're so useful, even when you're just swiping away on your phone on the toilet and you don't want anyone at your company to hear that you're watching videos. Very useful, but not intended for the audience they designed it for. So let's get back to the very specific disabilities, and we'll start with one that is very prevalent with males. 8% of males has a color deficiency, meaning they have problems seeing and identifying a very specific color. In the example you see on screen, it's a traffic light. Pretty much everybody knows that a traffic light has a red and a green light, meaning that somebody has to stop or is able to cross. For people with a deficiency, for example, in this image, it's a deutero anomaly, meaning they lack the ability to distinguish the color green from everything else. Very common among men, but also very problematic for the example of red and green, because green is, well, without green, just a white color, but red also has a green component. So if you take that away, it becomes a brownish gray kind of thing. Those are very everyday common objects. So if you take away the color meaning from those things and leave only the color, it becomes very difficult. In this case, you can see an image of a person stopping and a person walking. So you have that helping you to know if you have to walk or stop. But if you're doing very common things, very simple, fun things like playing a game, color is important too. The example on screen is the card game Uno, which you probably know and know how to play. But if we were to use that same color deficiency and play that game, the game becomes very difficult. If we lack the ability to see green, we cannot identify the green card from maybe the yellow card or the red card. These cards are very similar. There is also no other way to identify which card is which if there's only the color as a value. This is a well-known problem for the manufacturer Mattel. They have made it their mission statement to fix those problems in 90% of their games by the year 2025. So the ending of this year, they want to make 90% of their games accessible to those color deficient people. This example, it could be just as simple as adding an icon at the top of the card identifying the very specific group or category the card belongs to. So next time you want to play a game, a board game or a card game, look for those very specific details. Some games really have thought about this and added those very specific features to the game details. If not, it becomes very difficult for a person with a color deficiency to play this game well. So let's move into another thing about colors, and that is the very meaning of colors. When we see this image, we see red. Red is a color that in Western civilization is usually linked to something bad, something negative. For example, blood. We don't want to see blood. Could also mean love. Many different meanings. But in general, we want to think of negative things when we see red on a screen. This is a screenshot from an article on a Flemish news website, which has a subtitle that the Asian markets are doing poorly. Their stocks are losing value. When we see this image, it makes sense for us. But when you look at the details of this image, you will see that the stocks are actually doing pretty good. There's lots of pluses showing that the value of the stocks is going up. That is weird because we see red. Why is that weird? Because in Asia, and more specifically in this example in Japan, stock markets use red as a color to identify that things are going very well. Stocks are gaining value. This originates from a very practical reason that in stock markets, people used paper ballots to identify whether they wanted to sell or buy something. And selling something meant something was of high value. You need to be quick. You want to sell this. And those were red papers, not green ones. The green ones were used to identify something that was losing value. So, well, have a look at that later. What they should have done in this article, and actually they did after a couple of hours, was replace the image by a green screen. You might not be able to see it on this screen, but this green screen has negative things on them. They also have negative percentages. They're losing value. Something also that helps in this image is the fact that there's a person in front of it that doesn't really look happy. Could be a coincidence, but it does help this image. It is just confusing for Western civilization to identify this as green is bad. Now let's move on to something that I haven't discussed in my previous session, which was 2 years ago already, mainly because I didn't really know what neurodiversity was and what its consequences for accessibility was. So let me talk about neurodivergence for a minute here. It is an umbrella term, meaning it consists of many different things that you probably have already heard of. It could be autism, could be ADHD, could be dyslexia, could be dyscalculia. It's an umbrella term. Many things follow under this. They're usually linked, well, they're always linked to a mental condition, a mental issue. But the good thing is all these problems that are created by these mental issues can be solved. And if you solve them for these problems, for these people, other people will benefit from this as well. Let me dive into a question. That is, how many people are neurodivergent? It is something we've seen throughout the past few years that neurodivergence is becoming a more of a hot topic. Even though it is not new, these conditions have been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years. We've just only been able to name them and identify them. But if we look at how many people around the globe there are, a research by Adobe shows that it's about 15 to 20% of people in the world suffer from a neurodivergent issue, a problem with mental thinking. If we look at our sector, the tech sector, things get worse. We see that 53% of tech workers have a neurodivergent disorder. We are very, very much linked to these disorders. So let's dive into a very specific example, and let's dive into dyscalculia. Dyscalculia is a lifelong persistent issue with numbers. These users have problems identifying numbers or reading numbers, and there are many very specific examples that can help and demonstrate to you that these numbers can be difficult to read. Let me give you a very straightforward one, a credit card form. If you need to enter these 60 numbers into a form and there is no formatting, it is a bunch of numbers grouped together, and if you've made a mistake, if you typed in one wrong number, the value, the form will tell you it's wrong and you will have to correct it. It is very difficult to see sometimes which number is incorrect, and it's much easier if you group these numbers into groups of 4, which is exactly the same as is stated on your credit card. They group it into batches of 4 to make it more readable. Another very Belgian example is your Rijksregisternummer, so your Belgian EID number. That has a very specific format, and some forms do not allow for this very specific format. So if you add the periods and the dashes, a form might say, this is not a number, I can't work with this. But again, that's the very specific format of that number, so do allow it in your form, or show it, or help them filter it out. Do not just ignore it and ask them to put in numbers. It loses the value that the number has, because it starts with your birthday, which is something you know very, very well. Let me continue with a different disorder, dyslexia. Dyslexia affects around 6 to 10% of people. Dyscalculia affects about 3 to 10%. So this 6 to 10% of people. And it involves issues with writing, reading, grouping words. Reading is also an issue. It can take about 3 times longer for somebody with dyslexia to read the same text that I'm going to say normal person does, so a person without dyslexia. They often also swap and confuse letters like B, P, D, N, which is an extra difficulty. So something that might be a problem for these people is passwords. If you see a password on a screen and the person designing that form didn't think about fonts, things can get quite difficult. For example, if you have an uppercase I, a lowercase l, a 0, an O, if these are close together and are not differentiated by the font, it becomes very difficult to read. Not just for those people with dyslexia, but for example, also for me. I would very much enjoy to have a font that differs the 0 and the O, like in the example on the right. The Consolos form adds a marking on the 0 to make it different from the O. You could also add some color to differentiate between letters and numbers, which also might help. Do think about the colors that you're using for those color deficient people, that they can read it too and that they actually see a difference. Another issue that people with dyslexia have is they're easily distracted by moving things. So if you have a website or an application that has GIFs, playing movies, something that moves, animations, be very mindful of that. For example, Microsoft Teams is able to display GIFs that you put on your screen, but it only plays them one or twice and then stops. If you want to see the animation again, you can click play and do it again, but it stops automatically. For example, for me, I find it very distracting if I have my laptop next to me on a different screen and something starts moving. I will easily just get distracted and look at it and then continue. But if it keeps on playing, every once in a while I'll have to peek because it moves. So be very mindful when you use moving things or animations on websites or web applications. Also be mindful of auto-playing videos or audio. Can be very annoying, not only for people with dyslexia, but also for other people. Again, fixing it for these very specific cases and people solves it for many other people too. So if you're interested about more of these neurodivergent issues, problems, solutions even, or just examples, I would really recommend you watch this video by Vitaly Friedman from Smashing Magazine. It is a 3.5 hour long video, so be aware of that. It takes a lot of time, but is packed full with examples and solutions and also other things. Very interesting. Take a look at that if you're interested. Now, I've given you many things to think about. I've given you disabilities, I've given you issues, things to be mindful for, and you might be here sitting, how does this help me? It's super interesting, but how does it help me? Is there anything I can do? Can I help in a very specific way? Yes, of course you can. The fact that you're listening to this webcast or this video already shows that you have an interest, how small it is, into accessibility. That awareness is very important. If you're aware of the accessibility issues, you will help to solve them in the future. But there's also very specific things. If you're a technical person like a developer, a QA, or just a web enthusiast, you can do things in your browser. If you open the developer tools for your browser, could be Chrome, Edge, Firefox, any other browser, they have built-in tools to check for accessibility issues. For example, the WebKit-based browsers like Edge and Chrome have a Lighthouse testing suite to check your web page whether there are issues they can already see and that you can solve, like contrast issues, labels that are missing or not. They have color contrast checkers as well if you're meddling with CSS and need to choose a correct color for a text with a 4 in a background. Many things you can do. If you want to get a little more adventurous, you can also install a screen reader. Could be very interesting to see what your web page is like and if it works for people who use a screen reader. Do be mindful, know where the stop button is, because once a screen reader starts talking, it will not just stop. And it can be very annoying to have a talking voice in your head that doesn't stop. So find that stop button before you start playing it. If you are a non-technical person, there are many things you can do to test too. If you're using our products, put that mouse aside. Don't use a touchpad, use your keyboard. If you only use your keyboard to navigate through a web page or an application, you will find about 80% of the issues that are in a web page or an application. You will find focus states that are missing, meaning that you have no idea where on the page you are or need to click a button. You'll find that buttons may or may not work, or links. You will find many things. You won't find all, but it is very important if you do it this way to tell us if you find anything. There might be things that we missed, so use it with a keyboard. Let us know either directly to me or use our product board. Another way that you could help is maybe by being an expert yourself. You might have a disorder, a color deficiency, and that might be of great help to us. If you use our products and find something very frustrating, if you see something and you don't quite understand it, that might make you an expert, and that helps us. Let us know via product board or tell me, and we'll see whether that is something we can fix and make it better for everyone. Now, for years, I've been trying to preach about accessibility and make everybody aware of the issues, but I'm no expert. I do not have all the solutions for all the problems that there are. I will think about them, I will try to solve them, but I am not the expert. But talking about accessibility and creating that awareness is much more important. You having to think about it, if it's in the back of your mind, it helps a lot. It is that accessibility awareness that causes people to come to me and ask whether the feature they are building is accessible. It is that awareness that allows people to send me messages and emails and ask me about things that they've heard from colleagues about accessibility, or customers requesting some sort of accessibility requirement. And it is that awareness that also causes people to come to me and question my designs because they see something that is not accessible. Again, I'm not the expert. I forget things too. I might even make mistakes concerning accessibility. But it is that awareness that I want to install in each and every one of you today. And that brings me back to a quote, a statement that I made earlier, something that I really want you to remember, that accessibility is essential for some, but it is useful for everyone. That is your takeaway. Use that one in real life. Thank you for your attention. If you have any other questions, you can contact me directly, send me an email, a Teams message, stop me in the hallways, or any other way you find suitable. Thank you.